Today is the 80th anniversary of the dropping of the first atomic bomb over a major adversary in time of war. On the 6th of August, the atomic bomb Little Boy was dropped from the Enola Gay B-29 bomber onto the city of Hiroshima. A few days later, on the 9th of August, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on another Japanese city, that being Nagasaki. The dropping of the two bombs came as the culmination of a story of the Second World War that isn't given the same public attention as, say, specific battles or events. This was the nuclear race that had been bubbling up under the surface. Contrary to popular opinion, every single major country had been involved in the creation of nuclear weapons during the war to some degree or another. The Third Reich had early projects such as the uranium project beginning in 1939. In 1942, the Russian physicist Georgy Fyodorov urged Stalin to begin looking into a Soviet nuclear weapons program, and the Japanese had the NIGO and FGO projects in 1941 and 1943 respectively. The US and British collaborations, however, were the success story of the war. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki represent the final crescendo of the end of the war, the point at which the Japanese would be forced to surrender. Each year when this anniversary comes round, debates surrounding the decision to drop the bombs will naturally follow. Such debates reached their peak back in summer 2023 when the highly anticipated Christopher Nolan movie Oppenheimer was released. This movie traced the development of the Manhattan Project and one of its chief architects, J. Robert Oppenheimer. As expected, the movie also played into examining the morality of the use of such a weapon at multiple stages, seemingly implying at the end that such a decision had unleashed a series of events which would lead to the end of the world in some kind of nuclear holocaust. Almost immediately after the end of World War II, politicians, historians, and other academics began to develop revisionist interpretations challenging the use of the weapons from a variety of different perspectives. Some were legal challenges, others were moral, others still were geopolitical. Arguably one of the most influential of these early attempts at a revisionist interpretation was the 1965 book Atomic Diplomacy, Hiroshima, Potsdam, the Use of the Atomic Bomb, and the American Confrontation with Soviet Power by Gar Alperovitz. The book by Alperovitz, while not necessarily the first on the topic, was one of the first to propose a more sinister rationale for the use of the bombs. He argues that contrary to trying to end the war, the use of the atomic bomb was understood by senior US military figures to not even be necessary, and was only used to demonstrate American power to the Soviet Union. Put simply, Alperovitz argues that, quote, "My own view is that presently available evidence shows the atomic bomb was not needed to end the war or to save lives, and that this was understood by American leaders at the time." This is a position that is still held by many, especially those in the public space. A few years ago, YouTuber Shaun made a video about the decision to drop the atomic bomb. While I do not have time in this video to go through and respond to each of his points in detail, since his video is 2.5 hours long already, I do want to draw you to his conclusion.
The nuclear bombs used against Japan were an expensive gamble that did not pay off. They were dropped on civilians, intentionally, per the flawed strategy of morale bombing, to force Japan to surrender unconditionally before the Soviet Union joined the war. In this, they were a complete failure. The lie that the bombs were used only to avert an invasion of Japan was a post-war construction, intended to provide justification for a completely avoidable and indefensible slaughter of innocent civilians.
In this video then, I want to spend some time to deconstruct some of the claims surrounding the dropping of the bombs. The past 30 years or so has seen the releasing of new archival information surrounding the events of 1945 and the decision to use the bombs. These new documents shed greater light on both the US position as well as that of the Japanese. For Atomic Diplomacy, Alperovitz wrote this book in 1965, decades prior to these new revelations. This gives him, or at the very least his books, something of an excuse for perpetuating the revisionist narrative. Like what Shaun's excuse is anyone's guess. So I'm going to be relatively brief in looking at the background of the Pacific War and Japan's involvement in World War II generally, otherwise we will be here all day. It's a very Western perspective, though, to suggest that the Second World War began in 1939, or in 1941 from the point of view of the Soviets. From the view of a European, it began with the German invasion of Poland on the 1st of September, and the subsequent declarations of war that were issued by the Allies in the days that followed. For the United States, it began following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and the subsequent German declaration of war on the Americas. For those living in the Asia-Pacific theatre, though, it began in 1937, with what historians collectively agree the start being the incident at the Marco Polo Bridge on the 7th of July. Quote, "The start of the Second Sino-Japanese War was an unplanned episode, but one that nevertheless characterized Japan's gradual absorption of northern China." The attack on Pearl Harbor was a tremendous success for the Japanese. They had sunk 4 battleships, damaged 1, damaged 2 cruisers, and a further 3 destroyers. Their gains and successes would last throughout the first half of 1942, arguably reaching their peak when they had taken Corregidor, an island at the center of the Manila Bay in the Philippines. According to historian Richard B. Frank, quote, "The Japanese Empire now stretched across 7 time zones and housed approximately 516 million people, far more than the approximately 360 million captive people controlled at the peak by Nazi Germany. In its campaign since 7th of December 1941, Japan had killed approximately 65,000 Allied soldiers, airmen, and sailors, while losing about 15,000 servicemen. Over 300,000 Allied personnel had become prisoners of war." Historians tend to disagree on the exact point at which the Japanese Empire began to see its slow and debilitating decline. All do agree that it was in 1942. Frank, for example, suggests that it was the Battle of the Coral Sea between the 4th and the 8th of May that was the key turning point. Whereas Ian Toll suggests that it was the battle which took place a month later at Midway, which was the more decisive turning point. Quote, "For the first time in 6 months, the safety of the Hawaiian Islands seemed assured." What then followed from 1943 onwards was what became known as the Pacific Island Hopping Campaign. The strategy was simple: to avoid the need for the capture of the most heavily fortified parts of the Japanese strongholds by capturing islands which were least well defended. It was argued that the Japanese on those islands left would be useless to the overall war effort. Quote, "The Japanese would be unable to concentrate anywhere, their bypassed garrisons doomed to wither on the vine, isolated and strategically impotent." This plan seemed to have worked. The Japanese suffered defeat after defeat on land and at sea. The first amphibious invasion was at Guadalcanal in August of 1942. The strategy would result in a 2-front offensive, one making its way through the South Pacific into New Guinea, the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines, the other making its way through the Central Pacific at Makin, Guam, Wake Island, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Now pause. I think it's important at this point to discuss the Japanese experience of World War II, since it is nothing short of extraordinary. From their military philosophy to its application in the field, the Japanese would prove to be, arguably, the fiercest fighting force in the conflict. The centrality of this philosophy is opposition to surrender. According to historian Edward J. Dreher, quote, "The Japanese soldiers' propensity for self-immolation, the military emphasis on intangible or spiritual factors in battle, and the fanatical determination to fight to the death became the army's hallmark." Walter A. Skyer draws our attention to one reference of a Japanese soldier preferring to commit suicide rather than to surrender to the enemy. This was the case even if they had already been captured. Quote, "A Japanese major, not mentioned by name, sustained wounds, lost consciousness, and somehow fell into Chinese hands. Although Japanese forces later drove the Chinese out of the city and quote-unquote liberated him, a day later the officer committed suicide at the spot where the Chinese had taken him prisoner." The contempt with which the Japanese viewed the possibility of surrender permeated all parts of the Imperial Army. It was a social feature as much as it was imbued in the battlefield code of conduct. In January 1941, with the rhetorical and intellectual support of writers and poets Shimazaki Tonson and Sato Sonosuke, the Senjinkan, the battlefield code of conduct, was distributed. This was a pocket-sized military code which was issued to all soldiers stationed in China, and had several key mantras, including honor and dignity. Darker still, though, are the code's notorious injunctions to avoid the shame of being captured. The code would emphasize the disgrace of becoming a prisoner and the position of the soldier to spiritually and physically calmly face death, rejoicing in the hope of living in the eternal cause for which you serve. For US servicemen, the propensity for death rather than surrender for their adversaries was a common feature of life. During the Battle of Guadalcanal between August 1942 and February 1943, it was reported that, on the rare occasion that Japanese soldiers had surrendered, quote, every veteran knew this was an isolated occurrence and remained on alert for the next onslaught. The Battle of Peleliu in 1944 would all but wipe out the Japanese garrison on the island, with Toll noting that such casualty rates were, quote, inevitable given the customary Japanese refusal to surrender. The predisposition towards death rather than surrender would continue throughout the rest of the Pacific War. Even in the very last months of the war, the Battle of Okinawa, the Japanese would kill themselves before surrender. The commanding general of the 32nd Army fighting on Okinawa, General Mishuru Ushijima, committed suicide on the 22nd of June 1945. Of the some 100,000 Japanese and Okinawans who had been fighting on Okinawa in 1945, only an estimated 7,400 had surrendered. A similar civilian casualty rate would also be recorded. The point of this general background is to provide you with an overview as to the situation in the Pacific War when we get to the turn of the final year. The Japanese had lost. The American forces knew this perfectly well. The Japanese forces knew this perfectly well. And yet, they would continue fighting. This was the reality that US intelligence and military leaders had to take into consideration when planning for the eventual downfall of the Imperial Japanese. When it had become clear that the use of the bomb was going to happen, there were a number of meetings to discuss exactly which parts of Japan were going to be subjected to the force. The scientists and policymakers wanted the bomb to be demonstrated in a way which would maximize its impact. They also wanted to know the capabilities of such a weapon, so the target would have to be one that had not already been destroyed. For example, in March, Tokyo was firebombed. It was perceived that an already destroyed city would not give us a precise enough metric for determining the capabilities of the bomb. It also became clear from the targeting meetings that the bomb would need to be detonated over very large areas for maximum effect. Some criticized this approach, since this would invariably mean dropping the bomb over flat urban environments, i.e. cities. But in the minds of the American policymakers, there were only a very limited number of bombs available, with no guarantee that they would induce Japanese surrender. It was viewed that they could not take any chances and they needed to maximize the damage that they could cause. At one of the targeting committee meetings in May, Leslie Groves, the engineering officer overseeing the Manhattan Project, noted that, quote, the targets chosen should be places the bombing of which would most adversely affect the will of the Japanese people to continue the war. Beyond that, they should be military in nature, consisting of either important headquarters or troop concentrations, or centers of production of military equipment or supplies. To enable us to assess accurately the effects of the bomb, the targets should not have been previously damaged in air raid. Now, there had been numerous other targeting meetings that had taken place, listing a number of potential targets. Throughout all of these meetings, while some priorities shifted, these considerations listed above were broadly the primary considerations. Now, does this mean that Hiroshima was a military target? Well, it did house a military headquarters, and it did also play a very prominent role in military and industrial production, but it was also the home to nearly 300,000 civilians. So no, to suggest it was a purely military target would be incorrect. On the 6th of August 1945, a B-29 nicknamed the Enola Gay dropped the first nuclear bomb over an adversary. The bomb was nicknamed Little Boy. The bomb would fall for 43 seconds before it detonated at 1,890 feet above the ground. At the time in Hiroshima, it was 8:16 a.m. The time was specifically chosen for the purpose of ensuring the visibility of the bomb would be readily available. Those within 600 yards of the bomb would have disintegrated instantaneously. In a total, some 62,000 buildings were destroyed, and within an instant, some 50,000 people were killed. It is estimated that between 90,000 and 166,000 people were killed in the first atomic bombing. The reaction to the first atomic bomb from Tokyo was not what you would expect. That whole day, very little happened among senior leaders of Japanese officials. They reacted to the statement made by President Truman later on with indignation. Don't forget, the Japanese did have their own nuclear weapons programs, but they abandoned them as too impractical, especially given the limited resources that Japan had on her mainland. And so, quote, While senior Japanese officers did not dispute the theoretical possibility of such weapons, they refused to concede that the Americans had vaulted over tremendous practical problems to create an atomic bomb. But any sense of urgency that you'd expect having just been the first victims in history to an atomic attack were certainly not present. The Japanese failed to respond. Internally, there had been movements. Suzuki, the Japanese Prime Minister, had called for a meeting of the Supreme Council to be scheduled for the 9th of August in a few days. The Soviets would not wait for this. They had invaded Manchuria at 1 a.m. on the 9th of August. The Japanese believed that the Soviets were going to invade eventually, but that they'd be able to delay such an attack until they had negotiated a peace with the Americans. Quote, the Japanese army acted on the premise that the Soviets would not launch an attack on Manchuria before early 1946. Those ill-founded hopes were shattered by the Soviet offensive. The meeting of the Supreme Council would begin in the early morning of the 9th, at roughly 8 a.m. The military wing of the Japanese, who were perceived to be the main source of power at the time, were still determined to carry on the fight of the war. According to General Kawabe, the general of the Imperial Japanese Army, on the Soviets entering the war, quote, now that things have come to this end, we can give no thought to peace. There is nothing to reflect on now. We simply have to rely on the honor of the Japanese people to continue fighting. The position was clear from the perspective of the militaristic wing of the Supreme Council. The fight was to continue. The plan was to remain the same. Neither the bomb on Hiroshima nor the Soviet invasion of Manchuria a few days later made any difference in their minds. In terms of Hiroshima, most refused to believe that the weapon itself was actually even an atomic bomb, and that even if it was, there can't have been more of these weapons in existence for the Americans to use. As for the Soviets, primary sources clearly show that it was a shock to them, but it was not unexpected, and clearly not so much of a shock that it was going to invalidate the Japanese plan to negotiate a surrender. The meeting of the Supreme Council, the so-called Big Six, began with the Prime Minister Suzuki. Quote, in view of Hiroshima and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, it is virtually impossible for Japan to continue the war. From this point, sources tell of the first major deadlock among the Supreme Council. This was concerning terms of surrender. All believed that the idea of a quote-unquote unconditional surrender through the acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration was unacceptable. But some, more than others, felt that the number of conditions attached should increase. All agreed that a non-negotiable term was the preservation of the imperial structure, but beyond that, very little else was accepted. The military hardliners within the Supreme Council, Toyoda, Chief of the Naval General Staff, Umezu, Chief of the Army General Staff, and Anami, the Army Minister, all agreed that if the war was going to end, it would have to be done with the following 4 conditions met by the Americans. 1. The preservation of the imperial structure. 2. Japanese control over war crimes trials. 3. No occupation of the Japanese mainland. And 4. The Japanese should control her own disarmament policy. The alternative for them was to accept Ketsugo, the plan to let the Americans try and invade the homeland. They had rejected the veracity of claims about whether or not Hiroshima was an atomic attack, and in any event, if it was, there can't have been many more. Additionally, they doubted whether or not the Soviets had indeed defeated the Kuomintang army in Manchuria. Finally, the hardliners believed that the use of the atomic weapons would be rejected by quote-unquote world opinion. According to Barrett, quote, inside the Prime Minister's bunker, Toyoda spurned President Truman's threats of more atomic attacks, boldly stating that not even the United States had enough fissile material to mount the attacks Truman threatened, and world opinion, he predicted, would not stand for the use of such an inhumane weapon. As this meeting is taking place, at 11 a.m. a second bomb, Fat Man, is dropped on the Japanese city of Nagasaki. The effect of the bomb is hampered slightly by the fact that the hills of the Ukarami Valley meant that it was more contained. This was despite the fact that Fat Man was a larger yield explosive than Little Boy. So let's just recap real quick that within the space of just a few days, 2 atomic bombs have been dropped on major urban sites in Japan, and a further superpower had entered the Pacific War against them. The Supreme Council is informed of this attack, but the governor of Nagasaki downplays the severity of the damage. Despite this, there was, by all accounts, severe concern at the ability of the Americans to use multiple weapons of this sort. It was no longer just a case that there was just one atomic bomb. There could be potentially hundreds. The members of the Supreme Council had no idea how many it was. They could be attacked with all of them. Again, this had very little effect on the hardliners within the Supreme Council. They all continued to favour those 4 conditions that had been set out at the beginning of the meeting. Suzuki would then call for a vote at 1 p.m, and it was, as you'd expect, deadlocked. General Anami gave an impassioned speech for a continuation of the war, or the facing of complete and utter destruction. Quote, "I am convinced that Japan can overcome the crisis facing her. But even if the enemy repeats its thrusts and we cannot repel him, would it not be wondrous for this whole nation to be destroyed like a beautiful flower, leaving the world's prosperity only the great name of Japan and its brave, noble history?" This kind of gridlock and delusion would continue throughout the rest of the day. Anami continued to show vehemently the belief that Japan should continue. Quote again, "We cannot pretend to claim that the victory is certain, but it is far too early to say that the war is lost. That we will inflict severe losses on the enemy when he invades Japan is certain, and it is by no means impossible that we may be able to reverse the situation in our favour, pulling victory out of defeat." Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit in time. Suffice to say, essentially, the Supreme Council remained deadlocked for the rest of the day. Another vote was called at 10 p.m, and once again, there was another deadlock that was reached. After this final vote, though, Suzuki requested Emperor Hirohito to call an imperial conference. This conference convened at 11:30 p.m. and was comprised of the Supreme Council, the so-called Big Six, as well as further 6 members of the Japanese government. It was not usually custom for the emperor to involve himself in the affairs of politics. This was in fact a very rare occasion. At this imperial meeting, there was still, as you would guess, deadlock. It was vital to make clear that the hardliners in the military were happy to accept the Soviet Union's entry into the war, noting that it did not invalidate their plan for Operation Ketsugo. After further deliberation, there was still deadlock, as I've just mentioned, and so it was now time for Emperor Hirohito himself to speak. Quote, "After serious consideration of the conditions facing Japan, both at home and abroad, I have concluded that to continue the war can only mean the destruction for the homeland and more bloodshed and cruelty in the world. I cannot bear to have my innocent people suffer further. Ending the war is the only way to restore world peace and to relieve the nation from the terrible suffering it is undergoing." After all, the emperor had wanted to see an end to the war for some time. While it was still the decision of the Supreme Council to conclude the war, it was unlikely that the hardliners were going to disobey the emperor at this point. This was not the end, though. The emperor would have to intervene again a few days later when they got word back from the Americans as to whether or not they had accepted the singular condition Japan was seeking. This was the condition to preserve the imperial structure. All the other conditions that the hardliners had favoured had been thrown to the side. The American response to this singular condition had been deliberately ambiguous, stating that the authority of the emperor, quote, "shall be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers." This response gave the hardliners another reason to potentially continue the length of the war, arguing that this amounted to a rejection of Japan's single condition. Even the moderates at this point believed that a rejection of this single condition would mean Japan would have to fight out the war to the very end. But Foreign Minister Shinigori Togo believed that this was tantamount to acceptance of the imperial condition. Hirohito agreed, but still had to intervene again in order to break the deadlock within the Supreme Council. A day later then, on the 15th of August, Hirohito did a broadcast to the nation announcing the decision to surrender. What a story we have so far. But this is only the beginning, since almost immediately after the war, these debates began to rage about the events that we have just explained. The morality of the atomic bombs, their strategic importance, and the true rationale for their decision were all subject to debate. And so from here, what I'm going to do is go through each of the major arguments in an attempt to defend the decision to drop the bombs on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The debate about the use of the bombs is multifaceted, as you can probably imagine. I've compiled some of the main arguments, most are referenced by Shaun in one way or another in his video. If you feel as though I have missed any of the other arguments, let me know in the comments and I'll probably do a follow-up video or something of that kind. This is a very common argument and speaks to the fact that, for the first half of 1945, the Japanese showed a clear willingness to negotiate a surrender, as evidenced by their communications with the Soviets. The desire on the part of the Japanese to surrender was known to the Americans, both through communications with the Soviets and through American cryptanalysis, the project known as MAGIC. So why then would the US decide to drop the bombs if they could have come to some kind of conclusion beforehand? Well, argues the anti-bomb camp, the Americans were not interested in a negotiated surrender, they wanted an unconditional surrender. The concept of unconditional surrender originated with FDR at Casablanca in 1943. At this conference, the US, the UK and France participating, we see the issuance of the Casablanca Declaration. Quote, "To these panicky attempts to escape the consequences of their crimes, we say, all United Nations say, that the only terms on which we shall deal with the Axis government or any Axis factions are the terms proclaimed at Casablanca, unconditional surrender. In our uncompromising policy, we mean no harm to the common people of the Axis nations, but we do mean to impose punishment and retribution in full upon their guilty barbaric leaders." When Roosevelt dies and his Vice President Harry Truman takes office, it is clear that he is motivated by two main conditions. The first is that the US will hold to the legacy of Roosevelt and accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. And the second, the US will seek an end to the war as quickly as possible. Both of which culminate in his issuance of the Potsdam Declaration on the 26th of July 1945. The declaration was essentially an ultimatum to the Japanese to surrender unconditionally and immediately. The declaration only mentions unconditional surrender once throughout. Quote, "We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces, and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction." But had the US simply softened her terms, could she not have saved the hundreds of thousands of lives lost by the events in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Well, numerous high-ranking officers and officials certainly thought so. Admiral Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Fleet, believed that, quote, "the Japanese had in fact already sued for peace. The atomic bomb played no decisive part, from a purely military point of view, in the defeat of Japan." Admiral William D. Leahy came to a similar conclusion. Quote, "The use of the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance to our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender." So, from these points of view, it seems that the only sticking point in bringing the war to an end was in fact the US, with her unwavering commitment to unconditional surrender. The bombs, according to those in the highest positions of authority, served no purpose militarily, and seemingly this was known at the time. It is these kinds of positions that can draw people to the conclusions that there must have been some other ulterior motives for the continuation of the war and the use of the bombs, such as, for example, preventing the Soviets from entering the Pacific Theatre, or showing the Soviets the power of the weapons that the US now had. In reality, though, this position paints too simplistic a picture of both the concept of unconditional surrender and the place of the Japanese Supreme Council in trying to find a way to surrender. Tackling the first point then, the concept of unconditional surrender was not necessarily unreasonable. Roosevelt's consideration of unconditional surrender dates back to the legacy of the first half of the 20th century. The end of the First World War was very different to that of the Second. Germany, in the First World War, was able to be defeated through a mutual armistice agreement, an agreement which still allowed for the existence of some of the old structures of the imperial government. Even with the establishment of the Weimar Constitution in 1919, the old elite of the German military still persisted. The result was that the Germans had been able to suggest that they had not in fact been defeated militarily, but that they instead had been stabbed in the back by the elites, a myth which would be used extensively with the addition of anti-Semitism by the NSDAP, the Nazi party. In seeking an end to such a cycle of violence, Roosevelt seemingly believed that unconditional surrender and the complete occupation/reconstruction of the government that had made this war possible was the only way to ensure that no such war of this kind would ever happen again. Whether you find this rationale acceptable, especially when it results in the atomic bombing of two cities, is entirely up to you. What's more convincing, though, is the position of the Japanese in this whole surrender process. Many advocates of the Japan was ready to surrender narrative vastly oversimplify the position of Japan in her capitulation to the Soviets. Much of the debate surrounds the preservation of the imperial institution, i.e. keeping Emperor Hirohito on the throne. Earlier drafts of the Potsdam Declaration did include reference to the emperor, suggesting that there could be the assurance of a, quote, constitutional monarchy under the present dynasty. Quote, "The occupying forces of the Allies shall be withdrawn from Japan as soon as our objectives are accomplished and there has been established beyond a doubt a peacefully inclined, responsible government of a character representative of the Japanese people. This may include a constitutional monarchy under the present dynasty, if it is shown to complete satisfaction of the world that such a government shall never again aspire to aggression." Ultimately, what to do with, and more importantly, what to say about the emperor became the subject of quite a great amount of debate within the Truman administration. The maintaining of the emperor did serve a military purpose. According to General H.A. Craig, when speaking to Truman, quote, "From a military point of view, there appears to be no reason whatsoever why we should not leave Hirohito himself as titular head of the Japanese, if by doing so we make more likely the acceptance of surrender. He is primarily a symbol, and if we take over completely the actual government, his influence would seem to be well under our thumb." At least according to the positions of the people at the time, it was widely believed that such a condition to maintain the imperial structure would have likely brought about an end to the war, with the Japanese willing to accept a surrender on those terms. This turns out not to be true, as I'll get to in a minute, but even if it were true, again, we can understand the position of Truman as a leader of a democratic country, balancing the expectations of the American people. General Craig himself, in the above conversation, expresses the same view. Quote, "Of course, the final decision with regard to Hirohito himself is largely a political one, in which full regard must be had of the American public opinion, which has been indoctrinated for the past few years with the idea that he should be eliminated." According to a Gallup poll conducted in and around the time of the Potsdam Declaration, the majority of the American people sought to have the emperor treated harshly. The US had stated openly on numerous occasions that the official policy of the government was that of unconditional surrender, not surrender on conditional terms of the aggressors who had begun the war.
Both Germany and Japan can be certain, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that America will continue the fight for freedom until no vestige of resistance remains.
To reverse such a policy now may have backfired on the domestic front, given the hostilities committed by the Japanese against the US. Furthermore, the desire for the maintenance of Hirohito was not one that was shared by all. The Assistant Secretary of State, Archibald MacLeish, believed that, quote, "What has made Japan dangerous in the past and will make her dangerous in the future, if we permit it, is, in large part, the Japanese cult of emperor worship, which gives the ruling groups of Japan control over the Japanese people." Also Assistant Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, agreed, quote, "The institution of the throne is an anachronistic feudal institution. To leave that institution intact is to run the grave risk that it will be used in the future as it has been used in the past." From this perspective then, it may have seemed a crazy proposition to turn what was unconditional surrender to prevent such aggressive states from engaging in war against her neighbours again, to what was ostensibly, "Do you promise not to attack us if we let you keep your imperial structure, pretty please?" The final sentence of the draft proclamation makes explicit reference to "Do you promise to never do it again if we let you off?" Quote, "This may include a constitutional monarchy under the present dynasty if it is to be shown to complete satisfaction of the world that such a government shall never again aspire to aggression." In any event, this presupposes that the Japanese would have surrendered even on the terms of the draft proclamation. That is to say, they would have surrendered had the preservation of the emperor been made explicit. As noted by Richard B. Frank, quote, "Much is known and much more has been made of the internal American debate over the unconditional surrender policy. But this focus misses the central reality that the ultimate decision as to when and how the war would end rested with Japan's leaders. The issuance of the Potsdam Declaration, conveniently without specific mention of the emperor, caused some, but not as much as you'd expect, internal rumblings in the Japanese government. After the declaration, the Japanese Foreign Minister Togo had instructed the Japanese ambassador to the Soviet Union, Sato, to meet with Foreign Minister Molotov to present terms for a further lasting peace between the two countries, ostensibly in an attempt to keep the Soviets on side and to keep open the possibility of peace talks mediated through them. The result was, as you'd expect, Molotov met with Sato, but nothing was agreed, and he danced around the issue of major commitments. With the benefit of hindsight, we know that this was because the Soviet Union had no intention of being peace brokers and had no intention to invalidate the message elucidated by the Potsdam Declaration, despite not being a signatory to it. On the 11th and 12th of July 1945, wires decrypted by magic show clear discontent between Ambassador Sato and Foreign Minister Togo, with Sato stating, quote, "If the Japanese Empire is really faced with the necessity of terminating the war, we must first of all make up our own minds to terminate the war. Unless we make up our own minds, there is absolutely no point in sounding out the views of the Soviet government." Sato had finally snapped. The reality of the Soviet Union was that it was pointless to start trying to negotiate a peace if the government on the Japanese mainland had neither no intention nor no vision as to what surrender would actually look like. It is what Togo says later on, however, that signifies the true Japanese position regarding surrender. Quote, "The Emperor himself has deigned to express his determination, and we have therefore made this request of the Russians. Please bear particularly in mind, however, that we are not seeking the Russians' mediation for anything like an unconditional surrender." Finally, on the 21st of July, Togo responded to a message by Saito, stating in no uncertain terms, quote, "With regard to unconditional surrender, we are unable to consent to it under any circumstances whatsoever." The message was clear, but what about the preservation of the Emperor? The eagle-eyed among you might have noticed that the moderate faction within the government was objecting completely to the concept of unconditional surrender. Well, magic diplomatic messages made it clear, firstly, that the previous message by Togo was in response to a message by Saito, in which he, quote, "advocated unconditional surrender provided the imperial house was preserved." This is an explicit declaration that Saito had presented the best possible option the Japanese were ever going to get with regard to surrender. A surrender with the possibility of maintaining the emperor, and this was flatly rejected by a moderate in the government, Togo. As Richard B. Frank notes, quote, "By any reasonable standard, these exchanges between Saito and Togo from July 17 to 21 are authoritative, contemporaneous, and decisive evidence concerning the argument that an offer to retain the emperor would have secured Japan's surrender without resort to atomic bombings or even perhaps Soviet intervention." Frank also makes the argument that critics read these messages in the wrong light. Quote, "Critics read every Japanese comment that unconditional surrender was unacceptable as though it meant that unconditional surrender with the proviso that the imperial institution would be retained acceptable, but Togo had expressly rejected such an offer." Essentially then, a rejection of unconditional surrender is read by the critics as an acceptance of conditional surrender with the lowest acceptable conditions. Not only is there no historical evidence for this acceptance, but there is in fact bona fide proof that such an offer was rejected. Now examine this series of events from the perspective of the Americans. After all, these messages had been decrypted by magic and were readily available to them. There had been some talks within the government that communicating to the Japanese a commitment to maintaining the emperor might have brought about a surrender without the need for using the bombs. But as the magic diplomatic summary shows, such an option was conveyed by Saito as a possibility for ending the war. In response, Togo, in no uncertain terms, rejected this as an option. With the benefit of hindsight and bringing into the fold the discussions leading up to the surrender from the perspective of the Japanese, as we discussed earlier, there was no such agreement in place regarding the acceptable terms for surrender. While all within the Supreme Council believed that preserving the emperor was non-negotiable, the hardliners also believed in additional terms, as Saito points out. Quote, "Japan's military chiefs are intransigent about the 3 additional conditions, even after the 2 bombs and the Soviet entry into the war. Most likely there was no missed opportunity for an earlier peace." So, to conclude, unconditional surrender was a noble position when stated by Roosevelt to prevent further bloodshed, disembarking from the foreign policy of the First World War. It was a position that was stated publicly and expressly. To change such a position could have been democratically costly for Truman. Irrespective of if Truman had changed the conditions, he would have only done so with regard to the preservation of the emperor in the Potsdam Declaration. Such a change would have likely made no difference to the final outcome, since, as magic has shown, such an end to the war was flatly rejected by Togo acting on behalf of the cabinet. Even if Togo and the other moderates had accepted this as an appropriate option for the surrender in July, the military hardliners still rejected it even after 2 atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion. It was only when Hirohito broke the deadlock that this option was accepted. And one final point on this section, a lot of people are swayed by the words of Admiral Nimitz or Leahy. They are in the highest positions of office in 1945, and they clearly knew what they were talking about. They made it clear that Japan was defeated, and they were right. Historian Francis Pike notes that the last point in the war in which Japan may have truly had a chance of winning was the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944. Some members of the Japanese military questioned whether Japan had ever had a chance of winning. Admiral Yamamoto, in 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, at the very start of the war, stated, quote, "I fear that all we have done is waken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." But what people fail to realize is that being defeated is not the same as surrendering. Japan, in my opinion, were defeated by the Battle of Midway in 1942. They were defeated by the Battle of Iwo Jima, by the Battle of Okinawa. They were defeated by the time of the Tokyo firebombings in March 1945. They were defeated in August 1945 when the first bomb was dropped, 2 days later when the Soviets invaded Manchuria, and a few hours after that when the second bomb was dropped. The Japanese were defeated at each and every point post-1942, and yet they still didn't surrender. They didn't surrender until the Emperor himself had to break the deadlock within the Supreme Council, not once, but twice. The next point of contention concerns the debate about whether or not the dropping of the bomb saved lives. The traditional narrative is that millions of people would have been killed had it not been for the dropping of the atomic bombs. This narrative stems from the possibility of an American invasion of the Japanese homeland, which was codenamed Operation Downfall and was split into two sub-operations, firstly being Operation Olympic and then Operation Cornet. For the Japanese, they were already resigned to the fact that an out-and-out military victory would be unreachable. But a negotiated defeat, one in which they can save face and not accept an unconditional surrender, that was more palatable. The idea of 1 million American casualties was propagated by Secretary of State Harry Stimson. Quote, "We estimated that if we should be forced to carrying this plan to its conclusion, the major fighting would not end until the latter part of 1946 at the earliest. I was informed that such operations might be expected to cost over 1 million casualties to American forces alone." Now, you might be wondering, that's very strange language right there. Why would Stimson, in estimating the possibility of an expected attack, be talking in the past tense? Well, this is because this was written after the war, not during the war. According to Robert Freeman, quote, "Civilian authorities, especially Truman himself, would later try to revise history by claiming that the bombs were dropped to save the lives of 1 million American soldiers. But there is simply no factual basis for this in any record of the time." YouTuber Shaun also summarizes the trouble with the so-called, quote, "invasion narrative" by stating that,
now, before we talk about where this 1 million figure came from, I'd like to remind everyone that an invasion was unnecessary and not going to happen anyway. Whatever death estimates you come up with, 1,000, 1 million, 100 million, it does not matter. An invasion was not going to happen, and the bombs were not used to avert it.
In citing one of Shaun's sources, we can see that, quote, "It appears probable that the Emperor would have moved to end the war before an American invasion." Interestingly here, the historian who is cited by Shaun showing a little more restraint about drawing certain conclusions than Shaun himself, but never mind. All of this is true. The earliest possible point at which the US would be able to launch Operation Olympic, the invasion of the Japanese southernmost island of Kyushu, was November 1945, many months after the end of the final battle in the Pacific War, the Battle of Okinawa. But this stuff about the invasion narrative, casualty figures, and the necessity to use the bomb fails on two grounds. The first is that yes, there is no documentary evidence to show that Truman was told an invasion would likely result in 1 million casualties. This was indeed entirely something that was suggested post facto by Stimson. But this treats Truman as a bit of an idiot, someone who is unable to have even a basic idea of the costs of such an invasion, since while Truman did not have direct estimates about the potential invasion of the mainland, the US did have two other things. They had firstly, statistics about casualty rates for previous battles, and secondly, intelligence from Ultra, the wartime signals intelligence concerning the build-up of troops on Kyushu. With regard to the first of these, it should be noted that 1945 was shaping up to be the bloodiest year in the Pacific War for the Americans. In the Battle of Iwo Jima, the commander of the Japanese garrison, General Tajimichi Kurabashi, upon realizing that defending the island would be impossible, instead opted for a strategy of attrition. The plan was to try and induce as many casualties as possible to force the US to capitulate her demand for unconditional surrender. The common wisdom was that while American might was strong, her psyche was weak. She would break psychologically before she would militarily. So the hope was to force a utilitarian calculus in the minds of American military officials to see the concept of conditional surrender as more beneficial than the costs of having to fight the Japanese to the last inch. According to historian James Bradley, quote, "Kurabashi was aware of American public opinion when he chose to wage a bloody war of attrition. He wanted to make American people sick of the war by drawing out the battle and inflicting heavy casualties on the Americans." For Iwo Jima, the results were clear. While not securing a moving of the US from her position on unconditional surrender, the battle did result in what is estimated by Burrell to be 6,821 US dead. The Battle of Okinawa, beginning on the 1st of April 1945, was similarly brutal. Just like with Iwo Jima, Okinawa had imprinted into the minds of American leaders the difficulty of the task at hand. It had been a battle which saw over 12,000 US servicemen dead, and potentially as many as 90,000 Japanese. The number of civilian dead was far higher. Pike estimates as many as 150,000, whereas Bergin, who was a US Marine and who was awarded the Bronze Star for his actions in the Battle of Okinawa, notes that, quote, "Nobody has ever been able to calculate exactly how many Japanese soldiers and Okinawan civilians died in that campaign." In addition to having information about previous battles from which we can draw estimates, the US also had intelligence concerning the situation on the ground on Kyushu. The US military intelligence reports highlighted a surge in activity on the Japanese island by August 1945. The Japanese had correctly predicted US plans for an invasion of the southernmost island and were making their preparations. The exact number is of course impossible to know, but reports suggest that as many as 900,000 Japanese, quote, with 3 months remaining before the commencement of Operation Olympic. Operation Olympic had been planned with an estimate of enemy combatants in mind. This new intelligence statistic far exceeded that expectation. The original calculation for Olympic involved US squaring off against a fighting force of around 350,000. This had been the estimate that was provided to President Truman as late as the 18th of June. US intelligence reports also made estimates of equipment strength of the Japanese on the home islands. In July, calculations performed by the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Headquarters estimated a, quote, total enemy air strength of 11,190, of which 8,750 were in the Japan-Korea region and thus available for homeland defense. I would assert that, given the experience of the US Marines on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, as well as the intelligence reports for the island of Kyushu, Truman did not need to be directly told of a 1 million casualty figure in order for him to draw a conclusion in his mind that the invasion would have been incredibly costly. But more fundamentally than this point regarding where the estimates came from, the invasion narrative is given far too much attention in both the minds of the traditionalists and in the minds of the revisionists. The truth is that the invasion narrative is a complete red herring, as one of Shaun's own sources points out very clearly. Quote, "The primary objective of the United States had always been to win the war decisively at the lowest cost in American lives, and the bomb was the best means to accomplish those goals. Even if the bomb was not necessary to end the war without an invasion, it was necessary to end the war as soon as possible." Just because an invasion was very unlikely to happen and very unlikely to have been necessary, it does not mean that US servicemen were not at risk for every single day that the war continued. Despite no campaigns following the Battle of Okinawa, deaths were still mounting. One particular harrowing event took place on the 30th of July 1945, when the USS Indianapolis was struck by a Type 95 torpedo. The boat sank, leaving 890 men in the water to be killed by exposure, hypothermia, and shark attacks. Many were left in states of delirium from hallucinations. Only 316 men survived the ordeal. Historian Samuel J. Walker estimates, admittedly quite broadly, that given the casualties that occurred between the end of the Battle of Okinawa and the dropping of the bombs, and extrapolating this into further months, there may have been as many as 9,700 more deaths before Japan surrendered. Quote, "If Truman had been confronted with the choice on the one hand of using the atomic bomb or, on the other, permitting the deaths of 9,700 soldiers and a significant number of sailors, there is no reason to believe that he would have refrained from authorizing the bomb. He would most certainly have made the same choice if the number projected had been much smaller." Now, to be very clear, it is impossible to know exactly how many US personnel would have died had the bombs not been used. It may have been the case that Japan were willing to surrender in the exact same terms at the exact same time, though I would doubt that characterization given what we've already discussed. It might also have been the case that Japan weren't going to surrender for another month, another 2 months, another 3 months. Anyone who suggests that there is any way of knowing is lying to you. While Hirohito saw that the war needed to end, and this was the view shared by many of the moderates within the Supreme Council, there was still clearly disagreement as to the terms of such a surrender.
Because beyond whether the bombs were necessary, we also need to ask whether or not it was necessary to use the bombs in the manner in which they were used. There are other ways to use nuclear bombs than to drop them on civilians, of course.
This is an interesting point. Simply put, was the use of the atomic bomb on a city the only option available to the Americans at the time? Could they not have shown the capabilities of the weapon by, say, dropping it over a barren island or a desert or something? The first suggestion of this in relation to the Manhattan Project came from a report in June 1945 called the Frank Report. This was a document which had been signed by a number of physicists who had been working on the project. Its main purpose was to try and caution against the use of the bombs on Japan as a method of inducing surrender. The concerns were clear. The US would be unable to keep atomic secrets indefinitely, and the use of the weapon in such an offensive manner would prompt a nuclear arms race, something which does ostensibly happen during the Cold War. The conclusion of the Frank Report suggested not using the weapons at all, but instead using the weapons as part of a technical demonstration. But it is unclear whether or not this was supposed to take place before or after the surrender of Japan, i.e., would the demonstration be as some kind of threat to the Japanese? Or would it be for the purpose of trying to prevent an international arms race in the Cold War era? Shaun takes the former of these approaches and says at 1 hour 54,
"Now allow me to lay my cards on the table here and say that this is how I think things should have been handled. A public announcement and demonstration of the bomb, coupled with an explicit warning to Japan, would have provided the peace faction in the Japanese government with the exact same excuse to quit without blaming their military."
Now, I would like to spend some time talking about the proposal of the Frank Report. It should be noted immediately at the outset that the proposal to, quote, demonstrate the use of the atomic bomb was very, very risky. The US only had 2 of these weapons in early August and was unlikely to have any more for a few weeks. They would be banking on the fact that Japan would surrender through simply the demonstration of this weapon, and they'd be using 50% of their entire stockpile to do so. Given what we and the US at the time knew already about the position of the Supreme Council from Magic, it would take quite the convincing to suggest the Supreme Council would completely reverse their position on the matter of the demonstration of one of the weapons on a remote island. In fact, those hardliners within the Supreme Council didn't even believe that the first attack on Hiroshima was an atomic bomb in the first place, let alone that the US had any more. Those hopes were completely dashed when the second bomb struck Nagasaki. Coupled with the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, this created what we call a twin shock, necessary for, firstly, bringing the emperor directly into the political fold, and secondly, providing enough ammunition for the moderates to insist on accepting the Potsdam Declaration without the additional terms the hardliners like Anami were demanding. Furthermore, we have to remember the position of Truman as an elected leader and his goals to end the war as quickly as possible to save American lives. The suggestion to stage a demonstration would mean that the US have access to a very limited number of weapons of this kind, and they're deciding to use them as a presentation rather than to try and use them for maximum effect. As Maddox dutifully opines, quote, "Consider the proposal to stage a technical demonstration, thereby enabling the United States to say, you see what sort of weapon we had but did not use? How would the American people, especially those with loved ones in the armed forces, respond to such a message? If Japan refused to surrender, would they be willing to watch casualties mount while American officials sought UN sanction for use of a bomb?" The proposal just did not sit with the goals and intelligence of the US at the time. It wasn't the first proposal of this kind though, just the most formal. As early as May, there had been discussions regarding the use of a demonstration of the weapon rather than necessarily bombing a city, but this was dismissed for a number of reasons. Firstly, the bombs were incredibly new and novel technologies. There was no guarantee that they'd even work. So to demonstrate the quote-unquote power of the bomb that didn't work would have had the opposite effects in the mind of policymakers, given that it would likely have strengthened Japanese resolve. At least if it didn't work when dropped unannounced on a city, there would be very little harm done. There were also fears that an announcement would give the Japanese the opportunity to turn the whole demonstration into some kind of PR disaster. For example, there were concerns that they could move American POWs to the target site, thereby further alienating the administration in the minds of American society. All of these reasons ultimately led the Frank Report to being rejected by other scientists. In response to the report, in fact, Oppenheimer, Lawrence, and Fermi wrote a rejoinder where they agreed with the findings of an earlier interim committee. Quote, "We can propose no technical demonstration likely to bring an end to the war. We see no acceptable alternative to direct military use." Before we move on to the next point, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the chief architect of the Frank Report. This is a physicist by the name of Leo Szilard. Historian Robert James Maddox goes to great length in his book, Weapons for Victory, discussing the character of Szilard. By all accounts, Szilard was a brilliant physicist, having contributed to the first ever creation of a self-sustained chain reaction in 1942. I would also go as far as to say that Szilard was correct about the threat of nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union. This is something that would go on to permeate the Cold War for its entire duration. But according to Maddox as well, Szilard was also, quote, arrogant, intemperate in argument, and absolutely certain about whatever position he took, even if he had recently changed it. Maddox then goes to great length in the book documenting the clashes Szilard had with various other members of the Manhattan Project, while landing on positions like a pinball, and concludes that, quote, over the past 18 months, Szilard had moved from urging that the bomb be used, to assuming with apprehension that it would be used, to opposing even a demonstration, and now in the Frank Report to advocating a demonstration for representatives of the United Nations, from which the Japanese would be excluded. Szilard was always stimulating, a colleague has recently written of him, but also very annoying because he would change his mind very often and without warning. Szilard himself, in changing his mind, would then go on to state that, quote, I think it is clear that you can't demonstrate a bomb over an uninhabited island, you have to demolish a city. And I know what you're going to say to all of this. Yeah, it sounds like this Szilard dude is a bit of a dick, but it doesn't mean he's necessarily wrong. You already said that he was correct regarding a post-war world, so why dismiss his points? Well, apart from the already spoken about practical reasons for doing so, I'd add that at the time these decisions were being made, it was paramount that reasoned, well-informed and supported decisions were being made. Whether you think it would have worked or not, the proposal to demonstrate the bomb rather than to use it was very risky. So having the man who proposed it be someone who made enemies a lot, and who more importantly changed his mind with the changing of the wind, meant that the Frank Report was always going to be met with skepticism. I've saved the best for last here. Arguably the most extensive argument that has been had with regard to the use of the bombs was whether or not A, they were necessary in the face of a Soviet invasion, and B, whether or not they were the opening salvo in this new Cold War, an example of what is described as atomic diplomacy. Shaun in his video gives some credence to this argument regarding atomic diplomacy, but admittedly he does not go so far to suggest it was the only reason.
But this evidence has led some to conclude that the bombs were dropped solely to intimidate Russia, and this is going much too far in my opinion. Anyone who points to a singular reason as the explanation for why the bombs were dropped is definitely oversimplifying the history.
Now, you're not going to believe this, but I actually am going to agree almost completely with Shaun here on this point. There was some motivation, probably, in the back of the minds of US leaders that the dropping of the bomb would have had some sort of benefit to the US in the event of an already hotting up of tensions between them and the Soviet Union. Almost definitely we can conclude that this was the case. There are various quotations from senior leaders which seem to point to this being in their minds at the time the attacks had taken place. Quote, the thing to do was to get this surrender through as quickly as we can before Russia should get down in reach of the Japanese homeland. It was of great importance to get the homeland in our hands before the Russians could put any substantial claim to occupy and help rule it. Now, I'm not going to dive into the merits of the atomic diplomacy claim here. There are already plenty of academic literature on the topic already, and I will cite some in the description below. Maybe one day I will, but instead I want to talk a little bit about the Soviet invasion of Manchuria against the backdrop of the atomic bombings. Usually, the revisionist position will like to speak about the influence of the Soviet invasion as though it was a morally superior option to the dropping of the bombs. The bombs were not necessary since it was the Soviets that brought the war to an end, therefore the bombs are indefensible. Ultimately, the true cause for what brought the war to an end in the minds of the Supreme Council is a matter of real technical dispute. I tend to sit more in the camp of it being a combination of the two, with the third additional consideration that is often not mentioned, that being that there was a real threat of an uprising from within the Japanese mainland. Truthfully speaking, the bombs and the Soviet invasion happen literally within days of each other. The invasion and the second bomb happen within just a few hours. Each hardline member on the Supreme Council seem to treat the Soviet invasion as, yes, a shock, but not something that they can't endure. Instead of bringing them to the surrender table, they seemingly double down. As Frank argues, quote, the Soviet bolt from Manchuria galvanized Japan's soldiers to commence plans to declare martial law, terminate civilian government, and rule from imperial headquarters. But even if there was only the need for a Soviet intervention to bring Japan to surrender, this does not mean that this is the most defensible option. According to Bernstein, quote, "In view of the great impact of Soviet entry, it does seem quite probable, indeed, more likely than not, that Japan would have surrendered before November without the use of the A-bomb, but after Soviet intervention in the war." I think that these kinds of conclusions speak to the relative importance that we have in the West to the Soviet intervention in Manchuria. To most of us who know about the history of this conflict, we tend to treat the Soviet invasion as a mere event, one that just happens and that we spend most of our time moralizing about the impact of the 2 atomic bombs. But to do so would miss the serious impact that the Soviet invasion had on non-combatants in Manchuria. Unknown to many, the Soviet Manchurian campaign was stained with atrocities and war crimes as well. According to Dower, quote, "The Japanese government estimated that over 1.3 million Japanese soldiers and civilians surrendered to the Soviet Union in Manchuria and Northern Asia in August 1945. But over the course of the next 4 years, only 1 million were repatriated to Japan, leaving more than 300,000 accounted for and presumed to have died after August 1945. The Soviets would also inflict countless sexual violence on the Japanese, Chinese, and Korean civilians during and after the Manchurian campaign. Kazuko Kuramatu recalls that the Soviets invading Manchuria had been, quote, "the wildest, most undisciplined bunch of soldiers pillaging and raping." With reference specifically to Korea, quote, "The Red Army committed depredation against the Japanese and Koreans, including rape and looting, on what appears to have been a wide scale, and which went quite beyond taking revenge against the enemy and its Korean allies." According to historian Tilman Barrett, quote, "The most prominent was the massacre at Gigimiao in the southern part of the Western Front. Some 1,800 refugees had sought shelter in a Tibetan lamasery, which was then overrun by Russian armoured troops. Reportedly, more than 1,000 civilians were killed and scores of women were raped in a 2-hour period on August the 14th. By any estimation, the some 300,000 Japanese POWs and civilians who are non-combatants, who presumably were killed by the Soviets in one way or another, constitutes a far higher number of deaths than any conceivable estimate for both the atomic bombings combined. Couple this with the mass rapes and other forms of violence committed against Chinese and Korean civilians, it's hard to understand why anyone, being given the choice of more of this, would gladly suggest it is a better option than the atomic bombs. Had the Japanese resolve continued for just a couple more weeks after the Soviet invasion, then it would have brought more civilians and more non-combatants into their grip. Quote, "Soviet seizure of Hokkaido would have jeopardized another 3 million Japanese non-combatants. If Japanese civilians on Hokkaido perished at the same rate as their compatriots in Manchuria, then nearly 400,000 would have died." So, in lieu of a conclusion on this section, I just find it strange that when all the alternative history is done surrounding the bombs versus the Soviet narrative, very little attention is given to just how costly further Soviet incursions would have been for the Japanese, Chinese, and Korean non-combatants. This is not necessarily to say that Truman, Burns, or even Stimson had these considerations in mind when they sought to try and minimize Soviet involvement in the war, but just that, absent any ulterior motives, from simply the perspective of preventing atrocity and death, it may be the case that the bombs saved more lives than it killed, regardless of if there had been need for an invasion on the mainland by the 1st of November. And this is the problem. When we discuss the morality or decisions concerning the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs, the costs of that decision are always accounted for and factored in. However, when we talk about the alternatives, the costs mysteriously disappear. Okay, now I just want to finish by talking a little bit about Shaun's video. I know I seem to be singling Shaun out a bit here, but this is for 3 reasons. Firstly, it is, to my knowledge, both the longest and most watched YouTube video on this topic. Secondly, it's a similar video essay style to my video now. And thirdly, on the whole, I disagree with it. This is not to say that I hate all of Shaun's videos, or I hate Shaun personally. I actually like quite a lot, and would recommend many of them to my friends. But I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the more broad problems I have with his atomic bomb video, rather than necessarily focusing on the history. Although I will finish on the history with one final point later on. Shaun employs a number of sources throughout his video. Obviously, he didn't just come across the information a priori. Generally though, I have two problems regarding his sources. The first is his choice of sources. If we look in his description, we can see that he cites a number of sources under the heading books. A lot of these works are by some of the key leaders involved in these decisions. We have the writings by Leahy, by Burns, by Harris, and by Case. We also have the memoirs of Harry S. Truman. Now, while this is admirable, there are a couple of issues I have with this specific selection of writings. Firstly, they are written by actors who have played a very key role in the story that they are telling. This means that they may be subject to certain biases which may shape the way they perceive themselves and the way they present themselves in the history. Again, the value of their works is admirable, and they provide key insights into these decisions, but to have 6 of the 11 books be these kinds of sources is a little bit sus, in my opinion. They do not, or indeed cannot, engage with the debate about the bombs in a way that contemporary historians who analyse the primary materials can. And so when it comes to actual historians on this topic, who do we have? Well, we have a book by Paul Hamm, we have a book by Hasegawa, and we have a book by J. Samuel Walker. All good sources by any account, and 2 are historians I have cited myself, but seemingly quite limited in terms of works of historians on this exact issue. I personally find the lack of reference to Richard B. Frank's downfall to be a bit puzzling. While in no way the first work on the topic, Frank's book takes an examination of historical sources previously not published, including the Senshi Sosho, the official Japanese military history of the Pacific War, comprising an eye-watering 102 volumes. In addition, his work draws on previously untapped American resources, specifically concerning diplomatic and military radio intelligence, as well as the publication of the conversations recorded between Emperor Hirohito and 5 imperial military officials in 1990. Some of these resources having been made previously unavailable to researchers, but Downfall as one of the most important works on the topic, certainly if one is trying to make an extended video essay on the dropping of the atomic bombs. You don't have to take my word for it, take the word of another historian on this particular question. Quote, Frank brought together the evidence already mentioned and a great deal more, including crucial Japanese language sources, leaving virtually every aspect of the revisionist case in tatters. It was not long before Downfall gained widespread recognition as the definitive work on the subject. I would be amazed if it were the case that Shaun didn't come across resources like Downfall, or even others of a similar quality when doing his own research on the topic for his video, given just how widely such sources are cited in other literature. But this isn't my biggest criticism with Shaun's use of sources. My biggest issue is his failure to actually substantially source anything he is saying in the video. It's a lazy way to write a video essay on a particular topic, never mind one of history. Just listing some books under the heading books is simply not good enough when you're making so many claims to such a large audience. Give the audience something to look into. Give them a page number. Don't just assume that we should all take your word at face value, since, as we've seen in this video, doing so would not necessarily get us to historical truth. I want to finish by illustrating my point about inaccuracies and false claims in Shaun's video by taking a look at one final point about the bombs. In listing some of the reasons why the bombs were dropped on Japan, Shaun makes mention of the fact that racism played a role in the decision. Now, I'm not going to defend racism of the United States towards the Japanese, or anyone else for that matter. Shaun is quite right to say that this was an America pre-civil rights, one which, not long prior, fought a civil war over the rights of Americans to keep slaves, and an America that would consistently employ racist tropes and propaganda against the Japanese during the Pacific War. But Shaun suggests that racism towards the Japanese...
This is also undoubtedly one of the reasons that Japan and not Nazi Germany was targeted with the nuclear bombs. It was much easier for the people behind the bomb to justify the use of such a destructive weapon if it wasn't going to be used to kill white people.
The language Shaun employs here is sneaky. Of course, he predicts that people would question this narrative, which is why he specifically mentioned targeted. His only argument here seems to be that A, the Americans were undoubtedly racist towards the Japanese, that which is true, and B, that Japan was always the target of the bombs and had been even before Germany had surrendered. Ipso facto, the bombs were undoubtedly used because the fact that white people weren't being bombed was more palatable to those in charge of using it. This is a gross misrepresentation on so many levels. Firstly, the quote,
"It was much easier for the people behind the bomb to justify the use of such a destructive weapon if it wasn't going to be used to kill white people."
only makes sense when you extract the key context that the United States, along with the Allies, routinely bombed German cities with destructive capabilities. Strategic bombing of German cities and military/industrial infrastructure was a key feature of the war. Notably are the firebombings of Hamburg in 1943 and the infamous Dresden raid in 1945. But Shaun specifically mentioned in the quote reference to, quote, such destructive weapons, reference to the atomic bombs, which of course weren't used against Germany. But I don't see this as anything but a distinction without a difference. The strategic bombing of Germany killed an estimated 353 to 635,000 people, far higher than even the most exaggerated estimates for the two atomic bombs combined. Another reason why the distinction between ordinary munitions and atomic munitions do not matter in this specific case is the fact that the March 9th to 10th firebombing of Tokyo killed an estimated 100,000 people, more than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The suggestion that US leaders were more cautious towards German cities and less towards the Japanese on account of the colour of their skin does not bear out in historical evidence. What then about his first claim, that the Japanese were targeted as early as 1943, or were always the target? This again skims over so much historical nuance and context that is actually very interesting, which is a shame that Shaun added this to his video in such a seemingly throwaway manner. I'll direct anyone who wants to know more about this to an article by Alex Wellerstein, a historian of science and nuclear weapons and professor at the Stevens Institute of Technology. I'll quote and summarise parts of his article here in response to Shaun, but I won't be doing it justice, so go and look at that article if you want to read it in its entirety. Shaun is correct in saying that targeting decisions took place in 1943, specifically in May, where a general meeting was conducted discussing the whole host of issues, including what would be an appropriate target. Previous to 1943, the whole idea of the atomic bomb program hinged on the idea that the Allies were in a race with Germany. At the meeting, when discussing the bombs, they suggested that the, quote, general view appeared to be that its best point of use would be on a Japanese fleet concentration, and that, quote, if it failed to go off, it would land in water of sufficient depth to prevent easy salvage. There are three considerations that need to be taken into account before we draw too many conclusions from this passage. Firstly, this was a meeting which was taking place 2 years before the bomb would be developed. It was a long way out. A lot of things could happen. Secondly, it was not set in stone, nor was it a concrete consideration. It was part of a broader meeting which included a whole host of other issues. The evidence that it is not a meeting which set anything in stone is the fact that the suggestion made in said meeting didn't even transpire. It was not used against the Japanese fleet, but it was used against Japanese cities. Note also the specific reference to its use in waters of a sufficient depth to prevent salvage in the event that it fails. Given how early the process this meeting was, some of the more pressing issues concerned whether or not the bombs would even work at all, never mind who the targets may be. So, in quoting Wellerstein, quote, the quote has sometimes been cited as evidence that the Japanese were always the target. Personally, I think this seems too loose of a discussion to draw big, concrete conclusion from. One final thing to be said about this 1943 meeting is that it squares completely with the US fears that the Germans had been close themselves to the dropping of a nuclear bomb. If the American one were to fail, then retrieval capabilities of the Germans might have brought them even closer to one of their own. Expressly in that meeting, it is said that, quote, the Japanese were selected as they would not be so apt to secure knowledge from it as the Germans. Now, to me, this looks like a justification for choosing Japan as a target over Germany that does not invoke race or racism as a factor. Shaun's claim that it was undoubtedly racism that factored into the decision, at least as it concerns this 1943 meeting, is bunk. The American concerns were squarely with that of needing to race Germany to an atomic weapon. When 1944 rolls around and we get the Alsos mission, the Allied mission to gather intelligence on Germany's atomic program, it became very clear that Germany posed no threat to anyone with regards to their nuclear capabilities. And so the focus would then start to shift elsewhere, namely to Japan. The next and more concrete discussions about targeting took place in the spring of 1945, at a point when it was patently obvious that the Third Reich would soon fall to the twin fronts of the West and the East. Again, quoting Wellerstein on the issue of racism, quote, I don't see any evidence to support the idea that the Americans would not have used atomic weapons against Germans because they were whites, but would have used them against the Japanese because they were not. This, in my opinion, is pretty poor from Shaun here. It feels kind of weird that a channel dedicated to social commentary, and in the past, dedicated to issues of racism, would spend so little time talking about the issue of racism in this very specific discussion. The throwaway nature of the comment masks some very lazy history, again without citations, and actually brushes over what is a really interesting discussion about the complicated relationship between race and warfare during World War II. If you do wish to read more about this topic, with specific reference to the Pacific War, might I recommend John Dower's War Without Mercy, Race and Power in the Pacific War. Dower is in fact cited earlier on when we spoke about Soviet killing of non-combatants. Just as Shaun summarised his conclusion in a single quippy paragraph, let me do the same. Given the information we know today, and the information available to those in positions of power at the time, you wouldn't find anyone who would have hesitated to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bombs undoubtedly contributed to ending the Second World War. While it did not necessarily prevent an American invasion, Truman's goal in coming into office was to save American lives. The dropping of the bombs did exactly this. Finally, any discussions about alternatives to dropping the bombs, such as continued Soviet intervention or further firebombing, never take seriously the costs of such decisions. The result is an uneven moral discussion, where the alternatives are treated as neutral acts and not, as is the case, horrific examples of human suffering that they would have been. I would like to say that while the title of this video makes specific reference to responding to Shaun, and while I have spent some time doing so directly in this final section, this video isn't really about Shaun. This is a video about the historical narrative surrounding the crescendo of the single worst event in human history. Just like the event, the crescendo was horrific. Even the most ardent supporter of the bombs would tell you that they were horrific. The legacy of the bombs in terms of their human cost are well documented. St. Okuda, who documented her journey through Hiroshima in search of her family, notes that, when seeing a young boy affected by the bombs, quote, "This boy died bearing a bitter grudge against war and against adults. He said that the adults made the war without thinking of us. The adults cheated us. They told us that Japan would definitely win the war. They tricked us," he said. "The boy was right. Children aren't to blame for the war." The Second World War took the lives of nearly 70 million people. It was the first war in human history where the civilian death toll considerably outmatched that of the combatants. The dropping of the bombs will continue to be part of that enduring legacy. They're a part of a painful history, one which we should all work to ensure never happens again. But in the extraordinary circumstances that leaders were in during the last months of the Second World War, they were in fact necessary.